Hello and welcome to Views on News. I am Jawad Tehami. Pakistan in the summer of 2022 witnessed one of the worst flooding, and which has been dubbed by some climate experts internationally as once in a century phenomenon. Around 1/3 of the country was inundated. That resulted into the loss of life of over 1,700 people. Massive destruction happened to infrastructure, agriculture, land and crops. People lost livelihoods, and United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres came to Pakistan, visited the flood-affected areas and sensitized the international community about the climate-induced devastating floods that incurred damages and losses worth $30 billion to Pakistan's economy. And also, owing to Pakistan's successful climate diplomacy, a loss and damage fund was established at COP27, which was termed as a huge milestone as far as climate justice for the climate vulnerable developing countries from the developed countries is concerned. Now, Pakistan's Foreign Minister Mr. Bilawal Bhutto Zardari has thanked the international community and the world and the major world powers which helped Pakistan during this time of crisis. He at the same time said more financial inflows are sought for the rehabilitation and reconstruction phase as well. And he also said that he will be highlighting the plight of the flood affectees in Pakistan during the International Conference on Climate Resilient Pakistan, which is going to be held on January the 9th in Geneva, Switzerland. Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif has directed the concerned authorities to prepare a comprehensive action plan to be presented at this international conference that is focused primarily on Pakistan and its needs. Ministry of Planning and Development has prepared a 4RF framework regarding this, which relates to resilience, recovery, rehabilitation and reconstruction. This particular 4RF document is going to be presented at this particular international conference. And this particular conference also aims to seek more help and support from the international community, especially for the rehabilitation and reconstruction phase. We'll be looking into all these aspects, and to talk more about this, we are honored to have been joined in the studio by Dr. Shahid Zia. He's water expert. Dr. Zia, thank you very much for your time, for being on Views on News. Really appreciate your time. So let me begin the discussion. I just like to touch upon the success of Pakistan's climate diplomacy, especially at the COP27, and sensitizing the international community about the devastating impacts of climate-induced disasters.
As the global community knows, that the devastating floods that Pakistan received in 2022, after the previous big floods in 2010, was a big blow to our infrastructure that was built to deal with these kind of floods. And the new infrastructure needs are identified because after the floods, the water was not receding because of the damage to the infrastructure or the lack of infrastructure. And Pakistan successfully developed plans and strategies that shared with the global community in the last conference, and there was a lot of interest from the global community and the donor commitments that they are willing to invest in Pakistan to reduce or the risks and reduce the cost of this flood and damage to the communities affected. Pakistan has developed the big sort of program for infrastructure development, and then as it's called 4R. So comprehensively covering the rehabilitation and the recovery, and particularly the resilient development. And when we say resilient Pakistan, we also focus on its resilience in its agricultural production systems, where we are struggling with the adaptation. At the same time, we are also making a big commitment to the global community for in the mitigation. Pakistan has developed the programs like 10 billion trees plantation. That is the big contribution globally as a Pakistani nation, and many similar other commitments, while we are well below most of the developed and developing countries in our environmental footprints or contributions in the commitments to the global community to address the climate change issues.
Since you have just mentioned that Pakistan, the world knows that Pakistan is a very low imprint regarding the carbon emissions or the greenhouse gas emissions that happen to be around 0.8% in the entire world. Yet Pakistan has to face and bear the brunt of the climate-induced disasters, and that very much was witnessed during these floods. What now? The urgency of the climate justice idea of this increases manifold when it comes to a country like Pakistan. Your take regarding that?
What I'm saying is that the climate change is basically the collective contributions of all the developing and developed countries are contributing into the emissions, where Pakistan is well below many of the countries in its environmental footprints. The way we are seeing at the climate change that all the nations are contributing less or more. Those who are contributing more, they also know, and it's now well established sort of methodologies and calculations where we can see who is contributing what.
Right.
And we can easily now also see whether they are contributing towards the mitigation and adaptation strategies for those countries who are suffering more. And this is a test that for those who are capable in terms of technology and the finance to support the Pakistan and the other countries who are suffering.
Right.
This is the test case. If the global community can generate a big support to address this kind of catastrophe in Pakistan, that means we are willing and we are getting ready to collectively address these issues if it happens somewhere else also.
Right, your point is well taken.
Build confidence of the developing countries that they are part of the struggle to adapt and mitigate the climate change issues, and also they can expect the support from those who are also a part
Your point
of
is
the
well taken.
problem.
We are honored to have been joined by another participant in the studio, Dr. Naazir Mahmood, senior journalist. Dr. Mahmood, thank you very much for joining in at Views on News. Really appreciate your time. Now, when we talk about the international conference that is going to be held on 9th of January in Geneva, Switzerland, that is primarily focused on making Pakistan climate resilient. And now, Foreign Minister is going to highlight plight of flood victims, especially in that particular thing. A document 4RF is going to be presented. International community's support is also going to be sought in that when it comes to rehabilitation and reconstruction of the flood affected areas in particular. So I would like to ask you about the success of Pakistan's climate diplomacy in the wake of the recent devastating floods in the summer of 2022 that also resulted in the establishment of the Loss and Damage Fund at COP27.
I think Pakistan's diplomacy has been quite successful to some extent. As long as it is concerned, our Environment Minister Shahid and Foreign Minister Bilawal Bhutto Zardari, they have carried forward Pakistan's case, I think, very convincingly at various.
Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif himself had been
Prime
at the
Minister
forefront.
Shehbaz Sharif himself also got involved in it. So, as you know, as far as the advocacy is concerned, we have been advocating Pakistan's case successfully. But when it comes to actual materialization of the commitments of international community, that has been a bit slow, because the as we know that United Nations and other international agencies have done assessments, and the assessment report is also out now. Last week they released, United Nations released, UNDP's report was out. So in that report they have clearly outlined the requirements and the strategy that should be followed. But initially response from international community was very positive and there were commitments, but all those commitments which were made, unfortunately only 30% of those commitments have materialized up until now.
That was mentioned by the United Nations report also, there was a gap between the pledges and the inflows of that particular pledge which was made by some major powers during when the United Nations launched those 2 flash appeals.
Yes, yes. And essentially, as my fellow speaker was also just highlighting, Pakistan or other developing countries are not essentially responsible for all this disaster, natural calamities. They are the result of climate change that is caused by mostly industrialized and rich countries over the decades. So this is the result that unfortunately countries like Pakistan are facing. So those countries which were essentially responsible, they should be forthcoming in their aid commitments also. So if Pakistan, it has been 4 months now, the floods July and August, and now 4 months have passed. In those 4 months, if 2/3 of the commitments have not materialized, that means the international community is a bit slow. So that's why this forthcoming.
What sort of reasons do you associate with that slow response? Is it because of a slow global economy, the donors' fatigue, or something else?
I think there are multiple factors. One is essentially the world economy is suffering because of Russian invasion of Ukraine. There is high inflation even in European countries. They are facing energy crisis. So they are too much involved in their own domestic issues. Their own economies are also, and that happened, this Russian invasion happened after COVID. So for 2 years, COVID impacted the world economy, then this Russian invasion. So even if they wanted, probably they could have done something. 1/3 of the commitments have been fulfilled, 2/3 is remaining. So this forthcoming conference, I think, is going to play an important role, and I am quite hopeful that with proper advocacy, when Pakistani team goes there, and I think now Pakistani team is much more prepared than they were initially, because they have now solid data, they have numbers, they have now they should graduate from relief effort to rehabilitation effort.
That is a very important point, and that is why a very important document that is termed as 4RF has been prepared by the Ministry of Planning, which is going to be presented at that international conference. We are joined by another participant in the show, Mr. Waqar Sherazi, is expert disaster response. So, Mr. Sherazi, thank you very much for your time, for being on Views on News. Really appreciate that. Regarding Pakistan's authorities' climate diplomacy that resulted in the establishment of loss and damage fund, what are the expectations now at the international conference that is going to be held in Geneva regarding Pakistan sensitizing the international community and garnering that support when it comes to rehabilitation and reconstruction phase?
Well, many thanks indeed, Jawad, for having me here today on the show. And as it was described by the participants, that the situation of catastrophe in Pakistan and requirements of heavy funds were challenged and compounded by a worldwide recession due to the Russian invasion and the uncertainty in many parts of the world. So it was quite expected that the pledges would not be materialized in terms of actual transfer of money to Pakistan. And the same has happened. But I think that in this critical time, when the overall world is facing the challenges of economic crisis, economic recession, it was quite a considerable success of Pakistan on diplomatic juncture that in COP27, Pakistan has convinced international community to pay for the damages and losses caused by the climate change in those countries who are not responsible for the climate change itself, but they are facing the adverse effects of the climate change. So in continuation of that, the upcoming conference in Geneva, I think that the expectations, if they are not if they are not fulfilled 100%, but a considerable amount would be pledged for Pakistan, and things would be on track in positive direction for the Pakistan and the affected people of Pakistan, I think.
Right, Mr. Sherazi, there's a document that is prepared by the Ministry of Planning in association with the Asian Development Bank, European Union, UNDP, and the World Bank also contributed to this. Now, it basically relates to 4 Rs that include resilience, recovery, rehabilitation, and reconstruction. And there is the framework as how these efforts are going to be in the future by the Pakistani authorities. Now, what importance do you associate with this particular document? And when we talk about the reconstruction and rehabilitation phase, the losses estimated stand around $16.3 billion. Now, there are certain media reports that suggest that half of this amount the government is going to utilize from its own resources, while the gap, which happens to be around $8 billion, that is sought to be garnered from the international community. Do you think this particular milestone would be achieved during this particular international conference?
Jawad, I think that it is a complex situation and there would not be a simple answer to it. The resilience is quite a different subject than rehabilitation itself. The resilience means that you're making your country infrastructure resilient to the climate change. You're turning your population more resilient towards the catastrophes caused by the climate change. And it is a long-term planning. It is a long-term goal. While the rehabilitation and reconstruction is a third stage in after happening any of the disaster, that is relief, rescue relief, and then reconstruction and rehabilitation. As the amount of reconstruction we need is concerned, I think that there is a report by the UNICEF that in terms of providing nutrition to the children of affected area, because the severely acutely malnourishment rates have gone very high there, and many of the children are at the risk of their lives. So the UNICEF has declared that only the 35% of the required amount has so far been generated or received by the UNICEF for Pakistan. I think that reconstruction and rehabilitation would be a great game that would involve mega finances, and the gap of $8 billion is a big ask for Pakistan. But if the international community reflects upon in the upcoming conference and these pledges are made, I think that things would be going on track and people would be receiving a good news in near future. But right at the moment, the international community will have to understand that
be discussed with you. Beg your pardon for the interruption. Your point is well taken. As Mr. Sherazi has said, Dr. Zia, it's a big amount, that gap that is sought by the international community around, which happens to be around $8 billion. Now, the United Nations Environment Programme research shows that the adaptation finance flows to the developing countries are 5 to 10 times below the estimated needs. Now they are going to be around $300 billion till 2030. So when it comes to this particular $8 billion amount, do you think it's a big ask to the international community from Pakistan?
When we look at these estimates, and as you also mentioned, the other global developments and particularly the Ukraine and Russia conflict, and also the general inflation and recession that many economies are facing. The energy crisis in addition to that is another blow. So we are asking something that I feel that may or may not be we will be able to reach near to this target in this conference because of the different sort of circumstances in the global economy and in the different regions. But I feel that we will be having a reasonably good support from this conference, and the commitments, because it is not a one-off thing that we need this much support for in the first year. It might be spread over the next few years, but we will be able to generate most of the key requirements that we need.
Right. Dr. Naazir Mahmood, when we talk about the United Nations Environment Program, it says the developing countries have to invest more in adaptation, yet although they emit very less imprint of the greenhouse gases. So don't you think it happens to be the responsibility of the G20 countries which have been emitting more gas emissions?
Mostly it is their responsibility, and $8 billion is not a big amount for them. For Pakistan, it is a big amount because right now, look at the condition of Pakistan's economy. We are looking for a couple of $1 billion from IMF and other sources just to keep our economy afloat. So for Pakistan, $8 billion is a big amount. But for international community, $8 billion I think is peanuts. Just look at what to talk about international community. Just look at our neighbors, for example, Qatar, recent FIFA World Cup. I mean, hundreds of billions of dollars are spent like that. China can, give $8 billion in one go, but we should not expect that. It is also wrong to blame world community. On one side, this disaster was natural calamity, but our own economy is also in a weak shape.
But 8 times more rainfall as compared to the normal rainfall in every monsoon season. So that is clearly climate induced.
Climate induced, that is.
And
but
that is because of the
blaming
emission.
climate for this, now countries, I agree with United Nations assessment that developing countries like Pakistan should be more, because now this is new normal. Even if we get this money right now and we spend that money, after a couple of years there may be more floods. So that's where the resilient points come in. So previously, 10 years back in 2010 when there were super floods, in those 10 years Pakistan economy, should have been strong enough to withstand that. That means dredging, not obstructing waterways. These are certain things that Pakistan should be doing. So on one side, of course, we call upon the world community to help us, but every now and then we cannot go to world community asking for help. Even if we get $8 billion, which of course they are not going to give in one go, they will give, let's say, $2 billion this year, $2 billion next year. But in the long term, Pakistan should be ready for more such disasters because climate change is a reality. And as all reports show that the next, coming 10 years are crucial for world environment. So that means extreme weather conditions will become a reality. They will become new normal. So if that is going to happen, there are other, venues also where we should be more prepared. Our NDMA, our provincial disaster management authorities, are more allocation for preparedness. These are the things which are required. So we expect world community to help us, but at the same time, we should also be doing a lot.
Right, Mr. Sherazi, let's talk about the loss and damage fund. So there, it is, of course, the first step in that particular direction of climate justice. There are certain other questions where what would be the form of this particular fund? Let's talk about this first question.
I think that the features of this fund mostly and largely depend upon the political commitment by the international community. And as mentioned by the rest of the two participants, that $8 billion requirement is not a big deal for Pakistan, is not a big deal for the international community. Since they have given multi-billion dollars to Ukraine, and in terms of the humanitarian crisis, the flood in Pakistan was a bigger humanitarian crisis than that of the Ukrainian crisis, because more people were affected here, more children were affected here, more women were affected here by this catastrophe. But it all depends upon the political commitment of the international community, which apparently seems to be a compromised chapter by the international community. I think that in this condition of lack of political commitment, the diplomatic activity by Pakistan has played a role of a catalyst and effectively convincing the world that as per the previous resolutions of COP conference itself, world will have to pay for the losses and damages. These losses and damages by the charter of the COP conference belong to a phenomena that if the climate change, which is certainly induced by the great 20 countries in the world, and the smaller countries or the developing countries are contributing very less amount to the carbon emission and rest of the climate change components, those countries, I mean the G20 countries, would be paying to those countries who are affected by the climate change in terms of catastrophe. Directly in terms of money, with regards to their rehabilitation, with regards to developing their resilience and coping up with the catastrophic situations created by the climate change. But since it was on the charter of the COP conference from a decade or so, it was not materialized. In COP27, held at the Egypt, Pakistan was the country who pleaded this case, and even in this conference, this was not included in agenda items. But on the pleadings
Mr.
of
Sherazi,
Pakistan,
when we talk about the overall environment globally, there have been many climate-induced catastrophes around the globe, not only here in Asian region, but also when we saw bushfires in the Amazons, also in Australia, as well as floods over there in the United States of America, and massive heat waves across European countries as well. Now, majority of these countries happen to be the part of the G20. So don't you think after these climate-induced catastrophes over the years, there should be a realization among their ranks that they owe the developing countries who are especially vulnerable to climate-induced catastrophes this particular amount regarding climate justice?
Jawad, you're very right. I think it is the climate change who have actually turned the world to a global village. That there is no isolated place which would be protected from the bad effects of the climate change if the climate change happens. And as the average temperature has already raised to 2 degrees centigrade, the bad effects are everywhere in the world. As you have mentioned, that there are big fires in Australia and United States of America, which has resulted in deforestation of on a considerable area. But I think the larger crisis is upcoming in terms of since the agriculture of the world has been badly affected by the climate change and the temperature changes. And moreover, you would know that there are more downpours in many parts of the world, but these downpours are not creating favorable conditions because there are happenings of more rapid happenings of cloud bursts. So the water retaining capacity of soil itself and countries to grow more food for the people has been badly affected. This is leading the world towards an upcoming crisis of food deficiency, which would definitely be affecting every part of the world. Means in the countries like US and Australia, we cannot expect that there would be a food deficiency, but the prices for food would observe a spike, and that would also affect the buying capacity of their people as well. So there would be effects in third world countries and in developing countries, but there would be worst effects in the developed parts of the world as well. So international community will have to reflect upon. There is no other way out.
Your point is well taken, doctors. Yeah, ideally and principally, which countries should be contributing to this loss and damage fund?
Let me also go back to the question you asked on adaptation, and that's linked to this also. It is quite often we see that the developed countries urge developing countries to do more on adaptation, and we hear that in the international debates within the developed countries that they also have to do more on the mitigation. Unless they do more on the mitigation, it will be hard and harder in future for the developing countries to adapt to the rapidly changing in the climate. Like we are have had heat waves also before the floods, and that also damaged 10 to 20% of the wheat in several areas. That is our main crop. So, what we are urging from the developed countries, they need to do more on the mitigation as they are doing in the energy sector. They also need to focus on the main pollutant sector, their sector, the industrial agriculture, that is polluting much more than.
Does that require the mobilization of funds?
No, that requires that they are providing support to their agricultural communities to continue with the present system or the production system or technology. Then the only the thing they need to do is convert those funds to support the more climate friendly technologies, so that the pollution is reduced and make it easier for developing countries like us to adapt to the changing climate. So, as it's easy to see who is polluting more, it says and we agreed at the COP that the nations would support it. It's quite obvious that it has to come from the developed countries,
right,
mainly from them, but it is a collective effort, because it can happen anywhere in the world,
right,
and more in the developing countries because of the lack of interest. It's a global and collective effort.
Right. Dr. Naazir, when we talk about the mobilization of funds which come under the ambit of loss and damage fund, which countries ideally do you think should be contributing it to more?
Well, for me, calculation is so simple. You know, there are G20 20 countries. If each country contributes $500 million, and $500 million means just $500 million. $500 million is not a big amount. And what are these 20 countries? I mean, they include G7 countries, the largest G7, grade 7 group of G7 is there. Plus, there are countries like Saudi Arabia, there are countries like even Indonesia and Mexico, and even Turkey is there, Saudi Arabia is there. So, for all these countries, you know, contributing 500 million is no big deal. So, apart from these countries, which were previously only a couple of decades back, they were also developing countries, but now they are part of G20. Like, as I gave examples like Turkey, Indonesia, and some other countries. So, these countries should be contributing. Even $500 million will do, we will get $10 billion. But even more than that, and what we have not discussed up until now, in this conference, they will also be interested in knowing how that amount will be spent. So, when Pakistani team goes there, I think they should be very well prepared with a plan to tell them the transparency level, because unfortunately, you know, transparency is a question.
Right. So, this is a very pertinent point that you've just highlighted. So, how and where these funds would be used?
Right. Yes. So,
so that requires a mechanism, the tools, and the financial instruments. So, what do you suggest? The traditional financial instruments and tools should be utilized for that matter, or some innovative should also be ingrained?
Basic structure is already given in the reports. If you look carefully at the report, they have given how the aid will be used and should be used. But just giving an outline probably is not enough. What we need is a monitoring mechanism, and that monitoring mechanism will be able to convince the donors that the amount of money, for example, let me give you one example. In the past 4 years, a lot of money has already been spent. In Pakistani rupees, you know, there are estimates that around 30 billion rupees have been distributed to flood affectees in cash. Now, there are major questions, you know, how transparent that distribution was. Of course, we know as Pakistanis that of course our authorities have tried to make it as transparent as possible, but just doing is not enough. As they say that justice should not only be done, it should be seen to be done. So similarly, transparency should be seen.
Mr. Sherazi, the mobilization of the funds which come in the ambit of this loss and damage fund, we have talked about what countries ideally and principally should be the major contributors to this particular thing. Now, what sort of tools internationally, the financial instruments or tools, do you think would be the most viable in the mobilization and distribution of these funds to the developing countries?
Well, I would say that let us not always keep blaming ourselves for having lacking the capacity of on all junctures. Pakistan has been having one of the most robust tools of disbursements, which is one of the most transparent tool, which is totally computerized tool, that is electronic disbursements through Benazir Income Support Program, which has been having the largest data set, and it is amongst the top 5 social safety nets around the globe, and which covers each and every household of Pakistan. So I think that we have efficiently distributed 30 billion rupees to the affected population. But this also involves a combination of techniques. That is a geographical targeting by the satellite images that which are the flood affected areas, and then focusing at household level, looking at their poverty status to provide them with assistance. I think this was one of the most effective tools in the world, and we have quite efficiently showcased it to the world community. But with regards to the behavior of international community, I would request that they should stop now blaming Pakistan and making excuses that since there is no transparency in system of utilizing the funds, therefore the world is hesitant to provide Pakistan with more funds. I think enough transparency is there. The cutting edge technology has been used for disbursements throughout the Pakistan, and the world should not be avoiding this humanitarian crisis situation just with the lame excuse of technical inefficiency or lack of transparency of disbursement of funds. There are other tools of monitoring available in the world, like in any place. With just a click, you can look at the satellite image that a certain building has been constructed or not, what is the construction status. With the banking system, you can just have a summary of how many funds have been distributed or reached to how many affected population, how many malnourished children have been provided with the aid, how many households have been provided with the materials, and how many housing structures have been emerging from the earth. So I think there is no problem in terms of having a monitoring system for Pakistan. It is the world community who will have to reflect upon.
Right. There is also this particular 4RF document also contains certain points which actually reflect deeply on this particular thing, the identification of channeling, management of related finances, and also to measure the results in terms of monitoring and evaluation. And now, Dr. Zia, when we talk about the data, the scientific data and the knowledge, and especially the reports which are prepared by the United Nations Environment Programme, how crucial they are for dealing with the future climate-induced disasters?
I think this time we have had better information and data than the previous floods, and to share with the global community with more confidence. And that was also helpful in preparing documents like these 4R document. And what we need to see is that there has to be a long term plan, like maybe 25-year plan to go for this resilient sort of climate resilient Pakistan. This is not a 1 year, 2 year program. So once you have the long term plan, it is easier to put in phases of these all these 4 R's, and then having the monitoring system engaging all kind of stakeholders, including the sort of people, common people in those commissions from those areas. And when we have the long term plan, you have the sort of visibility of what we have achieved, and the building resilience in those areas first, which are more vulnerable, and have those commissions from People's Commission also from those areas to monitor and report back to the
So, Dr. Naazir Mahmood, how crucial is it dealing with a cause that is the emissions? How crucial it is for the international community to reduce and set a benchmark regarding that?
Well, international community's commitment should come, I think, immediately in this conference, and after that, even if commitments are made, they should start releasing funds. This is one from the international community side. From our side, I think political stability is very important. You know, in a country such as Pakistan, we have been going through political instability for long, and international community also becomes wary if there is no stability in the country. So I think all political forces and non-political forces in the country should come together, because you know, if over 30 million people are affected in a country, it's a big, huge number.
It's a common concern.
It is more than many European countries. So it is a common concern. All political and non-political forces should work together so that international community comes forward with confidence.
Right, your point is well taken. Mr. Sherazi, the importance of the scientific knowledge and data as in the reports by the United Nations Environment Programme, how crucial that one is in drawing a roadmap for future in this regard?
Well, Jawad, I think that with regard to reducing the emissions, I think the international community, I would be very clear on that, and I think the international community is faking this. Like you have observed that European countries are now switching from fossil fuel to electric cars, but electric cars largely involve the lithium batteries, and processing of lithium from Earth is not an environment-friendly activity. So it would have another sort of environmental challenges associated to the processing of lithium for the countries where the lithium is available, and it would be processed for the first world in the third world countries. I think that the humanitarian crisis is there. The United Nations has already mentioned that the unattended birth rates in Pakistan because of the catastrophe and the water logging in many of the districts would increase. There would be more unattended births. There would be a spike in malnutrition. The 23% severe malnutrition figures have already been quoted by the UNICEF. And with regards to the reconstruction and rehabilitation, it has been said that the children and the old citizens are at risk and mercy of the severe winter weather in many parts of the country. So I think that there is no excuse for the international community to keep on waiting for providing more support and coming forward to join hands of Pakistan government to provide a better environment for the affected people.
Right, your point is well taken. Mr. Waqar Sherazi, expert disaster response, joining us on the phone line. Thank you very much for your time, for being on the show. In the studio, we're joined by Dr. Naazir Mahmood, senior journalist, and Dr. Shahid, water expert. Thank you very much for your time, also for being on Views on News. And that's all from today's Views on News. Till the next one, take good care of yourselves.